Donald and Liz. I would like to start with a few announcements on the behalf of the Ash Center. We would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Today's event is being recorded and the video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel after we conclude. You are welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of this event. Please send them via the Q&A button function at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them via chat, and that way we'll be able to organize and kind of go through them in a more orderly way. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Lizabeth Cohen, and our guest speaker, Donald Cohen. Lizabeth Cohen is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History. From 2011 to 18, she was the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. We've been on many committees together, and it's always a pleasure to do events with Liz and collaborate with her. She's authored 2 books that delve into different dimensions of today's topic, which is privatization. The first is A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, wonderful book. And most recently, Saving American Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age. At Harvard, she teaches on a wide range of subjects, courses in 20th century US history, urban history, the built environment, and public history. Donald Cohen is the founder and executive director of In the Public Interest, ITPI, which is a national research and policy center that studies public goods and services. He was appointed by Senator Chuck Schumer to serve on the Commission on Social Impact Partnerships at the US Department of Treasury, and his opinion pieces and articles have appeared in the New York Times, Reuters, the LA Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, the New Republic, and the American Prospect, and the Nation, as well as several other outlets. He's the co-author of the book that we're talking about today, The Privatization of Everything, How the Plunder of Public Goods Transformed America and How We Can Fight Back. This is, of course, sponsored by the Democracy Program at the Ash Center, and privatization is extremely important for anyone concerned with democracy, because democracy is supposed to regulate how we engage with one another, including how much is public and how much is private. Donald's book brings out a couple of themes which I think are extremely important for people concerned with democracy to think about. The first is how private power distorts democratic decisions about what to privatize. And as he goes through many, many examples, there's lots of rich discussion about how powerful private interests who stand to gain from privatization exert an outsized voice in these decisions about privatization, whether to privatize and how to do it. And then secondly, which I think is really what he's primarily concerned with in the book, the act of privatization of these public goods undermines the power of government going forward and undermines its scope and our ability to govern ourselves democratically. With those brief remarks, I'm going to give the floor over now to Liz Cohen, who will be in conversation with Donald, and I will return later to moderate audience questions. So please remember to submit those via the Q&A button. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Arkan, and thank you to the Ash Center for giving me this opportunity to talk with Donald Cohen, no relation, just making that clear from the start. And I want to thank Donald for his very fine book. Even for someone like me who has thought a fair amount about privatization and written about it, there was much that was new in your book. And I think it really deepened how disturbed I am about this dimension of contemporary American life. For our viewers who haven't presumably read the book yet, it's just coming out. This is a book that I would say is part history of how we got here. It's part investigative journalism about the many rather depressing facets of the problem, and a part call for action. So let me just say congratulations, Donald, on the book, and then we'll dig in. We have a lot to talk about, and we have about a half an hour now, and then we'll open up and more will come out. But I'd like to start by asking you why you wrote this book now. The audience, as I said, has probably not read the book. So tell us how you really framed this problem. And it's a problem that you show touches on many realms of American life. And just to kind of get the sort of checklist out there for our audience, so you don't feel you need to run through all of them, let me just kind of give some of the major ones that you focus on. You talk about prisons, where I think there's been a tremendous amount of discussion in public discourse about privatization. You talk about schooling, from charter schools and school vouchers to for-profit higher ed and student debt lending. You talk about transportation, roads, trains, parking meters. You talk about so-called public services that are being affected by this dynamic: the post office, libraries, potable water, broadband, the social safety net, to the extent it has survived, Medicare, Medicaid, FEMA, the current version of food stamps, SNAP with EBT cards, food safety inspections. So those are, I think that list covers a lot of the ground that you discussed. So what's the common thread that you want to bring to the fore here?
I appreciate it. And thank you, all of you. I'm going to bring Arkan and you along with me for every talk I do. There, Arkan nailed it, and that was a great list. So I've been concerned about what I've seen as sort of a multi-decade assault on government, on the idea of government and the institutions of government over the last, since I was, in the last 30, 40 years, something like that. When I was young, we counted on those public services, and we thought they were valuable and they were good. For most of us, not all of us, for most of us. Over the last 10 or 15 years, I've done this work. The organization I run in the public interest works with groups around the country. And so, and sort of sees examples of all of this happening kind of in real time across all those sectors, across geographies, federally, locally, statewide. But it occurred over time to me that there's something bigger going on. I think Arkan kind of implied it. And I'll say just real simple how I define privatization. It's because it's a term that people define differently. I think it's private control over public goods. And the way I think about public goods, not in the economics textbooks, are the things that we all need to survive and thrive, and the things that we need everyone to have, not just that we need individually. And there are a variety of ways that private interests get control over those goods, over those public goods, and that at its core, that it is an assault, therefore, on democracy, because we should be able to decide what they are, how much they are, who gets them, all of the above.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you the historian's question, coming naturally from me. And that is, why and possibly when and how do you think that this resistance to a robust public sector took off in the post-World War II period? And I think we should think about this period as a whole. And one could argue that coming out of the New Deal of the 1930s and World War II, things might have gone very differently. One might have predicted a very different outcome, which might have been the expansion of the social safety net, building on New Deal achievements such as Social Security, unemployment insurance, AFDC, correcting for the flaws we know were built into those programs, the discriminations that most of us are aware of, but moving forward with additional benefits such as universal health insurance and so forth that we know Truman tried for. So what happened after the war and over time to explain this shift? And how did the public interest come to rest so significantly on the growth and strength of the private marketplace? Was it just greed, or is there more going on here?
Yeah, well, Consumers Republic, as I mentioned to you, is one of my favorite books. And so, I feel daunted by a great question by a great historian. So I think there's a few things. There's the, during the height of the Keynesian period, folks like Hayek and Milton Friedman were sort of toiling in the trenches, figuring out how to reorient American politics and economics towards what we now call neoliberalism, but more conservative classical economics. So that was happening in the 50s and the 60s. And and then as we as a nation were expanding the social safety net, expanding the regulatory state, it's up until into the 70s, right, with Nixon. And so what you had there is you had the combination of the intellectual infrastructure, ideas and infrastructure being created, the backlash against the regulatory state, the corporate backlash, with food, highway safety and environmental safety, all that stuff during the early 70s. You saw those things come together and get organized, right? And so if you go fast forward to today, actually, so in the 70s, those that were looking at reducing the size of the state were doing that at the local level. They saw an opportunity to say, well, cities don't have to provide policing and sanitation. That could be done by the private sector. So the idea started to penetrate into governance at the local level in that period of time. Reagan comes in and just as sort of the propagandist in chief for anti-government rhetoric, but didn't successfully privatize much. By the end of that decade, corporations were organized in organizations to advocate for these ideas and position themselves to go for the gold. There's a massive amount of money to be made because we spend a lot of money in governments. So, President Clinton was the implementer. He was the one that institutionalized privatization in the ethic of governing and the language of governing. And then, the two big ones were welfare reform and private prisons grew in that period of time.
Well, I want to get back. We'll get to the Democrats' role in this in a bit, but I want to just mention a few other things that occurred to me in addition to the important points you've made about how we got here. And I would be interested in your reaction to which ones you think are really more influential than others. As I thought about it, there were a lot of isms that I think played a role. One of them was the kind of the rhetoric and the reality of socialism in the Cold War era, so that the American way increasingly becomes defined around free enterprise and free markets. So we're sort of heading in this direction. A second would be consumerism, which, as you know, I have written about, where with the explosion of consumer marketing and even consumer protection, as you were just mentioning, there increasingly the template gets for sort of way beyond consumption gets to be that relationship between the consumer and leading to, as you were just mentioning, to the Clinton administration, where the Clinton-Gore National Performance Review report of 1990 was called From Red Tape to Results, Creating a Government That Works Better and Costs Less, and basically said to people, citizen is a consumer, are you getting your money's worth? Reaganism, you've already talked about, and the attack on the state. Racism, I think, needs to be in this conversation, and I would be interested in how much emphasis you would put on it. I think the law of the land becomes, in the 1960s, a guarantee of equal access to public accommodations, to public space, to voting, to sort of the full rights of citizenship. We see the privatization of spaces as a kind of exclusionary tactic. And then the final one that I would want you to think about is the decline of unionism, another ism that I think is very important. From really the 1950s to the 1980s, we see this huge decline in unionization. And I think that one could argue that unions were a progressive voice that defended the public sector, and they were a bulwark against some of the worst abuses. And I think we can see this. One of the most interesting points you make in the book is how some manufacturing that was subject to a lot of government surveillance, like meat packing, has moved to not only to non-union places, Arkansas, Kansas, so I would be very interested in how much emphasis you would put on those other factors.
That was a great list. So I'll talk about three of them.
We lost your sound. Still, I'm not hearing it.
I think we lost his connection.
Yeah, now I think he's frozen.
Yeah.
Maybe you should, Donald, if you can hear us, maybe go out and come back in again.
Yeah.
And someone is saying, hey, oh, you're back. Good.
I'm back? Okay.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, I think this is the life of Zoom. So I'm going to
Privatized broadband.
Exactly. Well, we'll get to that. Yes. So 3 things that you mentioned. First, anti-communism. Absolutely. Essential to the assault on government. You can see the thematics, to today now in socialism. That's big government. We don't want that. We want the market. We want capital. So throughout, I think in McCarthy period, anti-communism played a huge role in this. The second is racism. No question. The weaponization of race. The example I talk about a lot is welfare queens, right? Where, because that's in the popular culture. Reagan talked about welfare queens. There was a woman, there's a book about her now, actually, with a Cadillac and all, the sort of iconic, fraud. That was about saying the government's about somebody else, not you. Serve somebody else, not you. And in fact, they're the undeserving. They're not, and they don't deserve the help. And yes, they're Black. So there's an enormous weaponization of race, which is hugely powerful because, later when we talk about what do you do about it, if you're not sort of solving the same problem and you're not in the same, you're not like some level of community or common purpose, then you don't get from here to there. And so this is the key way to divide us. And then unionization. I think there were a few other things you mentioned, but unionization. Medicare wouldn't exist had the labor movement not been around, been as powerful as it was in the early 60s. Medicare wouldn't have, because that got passed in 65, right? So an enormously powerful force. There's public sector unions now, there's private sector unions as a way to regulate behavior of corporations so that and be able to look at what should be in the social wage. So I think those things are all absolutely critically important.
So we've all been through a lot over the last 2 years with COVID and how we have dealt with it as a society. And I think as most people on this call would probably agree, we've not only been fighting the disease, but we've been fighting each other about how to deal with it. On the one hand, public health policymakers and advocates for a strong role, particularly for the federal government, which on the other hand, we know Trump resisted. And we every day are reminded of the freedom fighters who are fighting against vaccines and mandates and so forth. And much public money has gone into the private sector, to the pharmaceutical industry. And it is not only making profits, but it is also gaining ownership of a lot of those patents and so forth. So I wonder how, having written this book, you look at the COVID moment. Is it a great opportunity to change people's mindset? Is there a lesson here that you think will actually, carry some weight, or was it a lost opportunity?
In the complicated country we're in, I think it is a real opportunity for many. We're still very divided. So here's what I think many people understand now. Still the polling numbers still think people, we should have protections and PPE and all this, and vaccines and all of that. I think, for many, I can't speak for the hardcore opponents. We understand now that we all need to be healthy if we want a healthy country, right? That the health of all of us depends on the health of each of us. So that's number one. Two is that the market, which was Trump's administration's first go-to, let's just deal with the market, meaning put it, supply and demand. Let folks purchase the things they need on the open market, which created, of course, rent seeking and profit taking and lack of access to the stuff that everybody needed, that the market really can't accomplish. When we have an all-in moment where we are all impacted, there's no way the market can do that because the market excludes. The market, meets demand for those that can purchase the demand, can purchase the product. So it's completely the wrong instrument. Now, Do you need private companies? Sure, you need private companies to make the PPE and all of that. You know, the major lost opportunity. I mean, we lost lives when Trump, you know, Trump's first response, no question, but that we gave the companies the patents, right? That gave them the control over the intellectual property that we paid for. That clearly both a national and a global crisis that needed to get shots in arms, as many arms across the globe as possible, that we gave them the intellectual property and which gave them power and authority over who gets and who doesn't get.
Yes, well, it's not over yet. We'll have to see how this ultimately plays out. I want to remind you of the last part of your subtitle, which is how we can fight back, and turn the discussion for a minute now to how we can combat this, the privatization that is really damaging to our society and breeds inequality, undemocratic dimensions, and so forth. You closed the book with a 6-step program for how we can take it back. But to be honest, I thought most of the steps require somehow convincing people that there are important values in public goods and danger in the exploitation that comes with privatization. So I'm wondering how you think we can concretely get people to understand what they are losing with privatization. There was one step of your 6 that I think is a very actionable one. And that is the notion that we need to counter what Suzanne Mettler has called the submerged state. And I'll just give a couple examples of the ways in which to just illustrate to the audience what the submerged state is about. One is we're all sort of familiar with the conservative retirees' panicked response to Obamacare that when she said, "Don't take away my Medicare." Obviously, that was a submerged state moment. Another, I think, really poignant quotation that I'll just remind us of comes from Elizabeth Warren when she was running for Senate. She had, I think, a great rhetorical statement when she said, "There is nobody in this country who gets rich on their own. Nobody. You built a factory out there. Good for you. But I want to be clear, you moved your goods to market on roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. Keep a hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is that you take a hunk of that and you pay it forward for the next kid who comes along." So those are just examples of this submerged. So that rang true to me. You got to somehow raise the submerged state. But what are other things in addition to that might we do to really get this message across?
Yeah, and I think I would, maybe in the paperback, I'll redo the last chapter because I have new ideas even since I've been talking for 4 months and answering this question. So there is, first off, remember it's the long game. We've seen the shift over ideological shift, cultural wisdom, conventional wisdom shift over 30, 40, 50 years. We need to be thinking that way. So, surfacing the state's real important, right? It's all around us. We all are good complainers about things that we don't like, but the paint on our wall used to have lead in it. I mean, there is public all around us, and we need to surface it, as you mentioned. I think the other piece, and the second that you referred to as well, is I think we need to educate about the facts of our interdependence, right? It is both in our interest for everyone to have healthcare, but we, in fact, now we see from COVID that we actually need everyone to have healthcare. So and you could take that across the board into all sorts of public things like education and clean air and all that. We can only do these things if we do them together. The third thing, again, longer term, sort of the idea level, is we do have to interrogate the pillars of, ideas, conventional wisdom that are used as reasons to privatize. Business is more efficient than government. The profit motive and competition are the ways to deliver the most for the most. Those things create innovation. And there's truth in those things, but they are not universally true, right? The profit motive, yeah, sure, I'm sure it's created some things that we all use, but it also created the opioid crisis. It also created private prisons. It also created things. So we can't accept them as universal goods. We have to interrogate them. Efficiency. I spend a lot of time talking about efficiency. I get it every day. Efficiency is spending less on something and getting more or as much or more out of it. Okay, well, what are we going to spend less on? We're usually spending less on wages and benefits. We have an inequality problem. We're often spending less because we're not taking care of our externalities, pollution controls and other things. Okay, we all have, so those have impacts on all of us. So I think so it's really important to interrogate those things and not take them as at face value.
How do we get that message to the people who need to hear it? When, they're watching Fox News, I heard a farmer from Kansas or something interviewed on NPR who said that he sees a terrible impact of climate change on his farming, having to do with the amount of rain and drought, but that he cannot call it climate change or he's just laughed out of the room. So how do you get this across?
Well, I think, listen, I think the lack of, I think we need people to be connected to organizations and unions and churches and other places where they can process the world, right? That's the other downside of the reduction in size of the labor movement is people aren't in a community to help, not to be told what to do, but to help process the world. We all need that. And so if we're all individuals on social media, on Fox News, it's a little hard to figure out. So organizing really is part of the response, and building, people's organizations, citizens, civic organizations, and others to engage is super important. It won't happen without that. But I'd also think there's there's sort of a drumbeat but there are lots of folks on lists and emails, and there's lots of people who care. And so we need to figure out how to get that movement creating a drumbeat. Because it isn't just if we just tell them this fact, or we just tell them that fact, it's a drumbeat. And that's why I think that's crucially important. We think about that as the long game. Bigger civic organizations and unions and others talking to people, right? If we're not, we got to be out in rural communities talking to people, not just on election time, talking to them on a regular basis, developing relationships with them, listening to them and all that. So I think that's really critical. Now, there's another piece of folks we have to educate that's a little easier, and that is the decision-making class, right? That get, I do this all the time, meet with elected officials and others that, take those beliefs. Oh, business more efficient. We want to do it that way. Okay, you can have one-on-one conversations with those people. I do it all the time to say, well, wait a second, there's another part of the story here, right? So we need the organizations and the infrastructure that does exist to be having those conversations with elected officials, with people in the bureaucracy, because those ideas, that conservative conventionalism is just kind of in the air. It's the air we breathe, and we have to change the air around that opinion elite, as some would call it.
I think the fact that apparently 50% of American voters today identify as independents is notable, and perhaps an opportunity that they're not necessarily just, they've made, I know people who've shifted from Republican to independent, so there may be a kind of opening there. But I want to follow up on another issue, and that is the difficulty of addressing some of this when there has been a many years now of starving the beast. And starving that beast, i.e. government, has understandably led to some, discontents with how government performs and how its services really operate. So you underfund IRS and it doesn't run terribly well. Same with the post office, the Amtrak, the CDC, OSHA, we could go on and on. You deprive cities of the revenue they need. They go and they make deals with a corporation like Amazon and give away future, tax revenues as an incentive, and then they have less to work with. So, how can we push back when the reality is that many people are experiencing sort of inefficiencies from the government and seeing sort of bureaucracy run amok?
Well, first thing I would say is, can you hear me? Because it's
yes.
Unstable. First thing I'd say is, when you cut taxes and when you privatize and when you do the things that have happened over the last 30 years, you help stimulate the problems, the inefficiencies and the problems that you talk about. And then, the beauty of that approach is then you can walk in and say, we've got an answer. Let's privatize it. Let's contact it, right? So they are both the source of the problem and they are the.
We've lost your sound again. No, we still don't have you.
That's weird. The sound goes out.
There?
Oh yeah, now you're back.
Okay, I think you're back. Okay.
We'll be changing our broadband this week. So we can't just say, oh, you don't, yes, there's government all around us. There's good things all around us. You just don't understand. The DMV, in fact, in California, where I was actually pretty good, but, compared to what we are supposed to think. So we have to be the reformers. Then the question is, what's the reform approach to take? You can hear me, right?
Yeah, now I can hear you. You're sort of frozen and but that's okay. I'd rather hear you than see you moving.
I know. Okay. So we're the reformers. So let me just say a few things.
Okay, sure.
So the first thing is we have to set standards, right? People do know what they want. We all know we want good schools. We want clean air. We want to be able to get places. We want the variety. We want broadband now. Everybody wants broadband, and everybody needs broadband now. So we know that now, and there's governments producing and providing some of those things. If they're not good, we need to be the reformers, and you do that by two things. You set standards and you put cops on the beat to make sure that those standards are enforced and detailed. Now, you also need the revenue to make those things happen. And that's not a simple thing, how to raise taxes in an anti-tax environment. But I'll just say one fact that's really important to understand is that things cost money, and there's only one place to get that money, us. So when they say no new taxes, give it to the private sector, we're going to pay anyway. We're just going to pay as a commodity, right? So that's I think, and this is what the work that I do at all levels. We work with folks around the country to come up with policies and ideas that set standards, raise standards, and make sure that they're enforced. Then it's whether it's contracted out or not. We have all sorts of contracts. We're sort of delivering on the promise of universal public goods. We're making sure by using our power.
Well, maybe I'll ask my last question, because then we should, I guess, turn to the Q&A on this issue of delivering on the public goods. We have talked a little bit about how the Democrats have something to answer for in terms of what the Clinton administration accomplished. But, more broadly, I'm wondering if there is not a message here for the Democratic Party that the Republicans might have heard more clearly than the Democrats. And that is a feeling that I think many Americans have, that there is a kind of romance with expertise that the Democrats have, a kind of investment in government bureaucracies. If you look at the recent Virginia gubernatorial election, for example, we had the Democratic candidate Terry McAuliffe saying that parents should leave curriculum to the experts, and Glenn Youngkin, who won, saying actually parents' views matter. And then I'll just say one other thing that I think we need to keep in mind that relates back to the racism point, which is that there are many Americans who don't feel that the public sector is actually serving them very well. In fact, they feel it has failed them. I'm thinking here of the distrust that many African Americans feel about the police. I heard on NPR this morning that a quarter of African Americans now own guns. And they think it's the only way that they can protect themselves. So, we have to do better, it needs to be said, I think, on delivering as government. So how might you respond to that?
Well, I agree. I think, listen, governments are complicated institutions. Democratic institutions are make it even more complicated. The world's governing is incredibly hard. It's an always project to make it better and better. That's what I mean when I say we need to be the reformers. it's essential to what we need to do at all levels of government, whether you're teaching in a classroom to whether you're responding to Ukraine. So.
And that accountability is hard to build in, I think.
Yep.
But
and I think maybe people want to move to questions. That's why I wanted to.
Right. No, I think we should. Arkan, are you there? Yes.
I'm back. Hi. What a great discussion. Thank you, both of you. And we've got some great questions from the Q&A. And so keep them coming. And then we've also received some questions earlier for that people posted to the event page. So I'll be drawing from both of those. The first question that I'd like to lift up from the Q&A is from David Wood, and I'll build on that a little bit. And I'm reading it about ideology. So David asks, how should we think about the imperviousness of the belief in market efficiency to evidence? Because both because the ideology is in the air, as Donald just said, right? And because the privatizers are doing a bunch of rent seeking. And so I want to, the lens I have on that is it really a policy thing, or is it a cultural thing more fundamentally, right? So the first part of the culture, as you mentioned, is like Ronald Reagan in the 80s, government is not the solution to your problem, government is the problem. And then with Bill Clinton, I want to add to Liz's isms. Another one is entrepreneurialism. Right. And so when I first got to the Kennedy School and when I was in graduate school in the 90s, a huge book was this Gabler and Osborne book about reinventing government. And I think it still has a big imprint on Kennedy School faculty and students. Is a bunch of us see ourselves as entrepreneurs in government, breaking up the old bad bureaucracy and interjecting a nice dose of entrepreneurialism to better serve our people who are not citizens, but rather consumers, right? And so that's a core part of the ideology. In part to combat this, I had this made up. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah. It's my paperweight that says government is good. And I try to encourage people to say that. And many people can't even say it because the ideology is like, government is good. Oh my God, right? Kind of turns your stomach to say it. So what are the resources for changing the culture and making a little bit more open to the thought that government is good?
Well, this is such a great discussion. So I think that, if I think about the 40-year, 50-year assault on government and elevation and exalting of markets, the main accomplishment is a set of conventional wisdom, ideas that are in the air, like I mentioned and David responded, right? It's a belief. It has become a belief system that's far beyond just sort of, ideological conservatives. It's in the air. Business is more efficient than government. Of course, we all know that. It's good enough for government work, all these, things. So I think so it is in the culture. I actually believe that our central, a central task over the next 30, 40 years looking forward is to figure out what we want to replace that with, right? That it's, in fact, one is that, government provides things for us all the time that we rely on. And number one. Number two, that we are interdependent. The things that I call public goods, I believe can only be done if we do them together. You can't get the air clean unless you do it together, which means government, but it could mean private, public, could mean private's involved, but whether it's government regulation or government provision, but you can't do it. You can't get a letter at the same price to any corner of the country without the government, right? So there's sort of an set of conventional wisdom ideas that we should be heading towards, in my belief, and I think that's and then it's like I was saying, the drumbeat. Everyone's got a story. People's first go-to is the DMV. I don't think most people have been in the DMV anymore. Most of this is online now, right? So I think if there's I say this to public sector workers that I talk, there's 20 million people who work for government who should be telling stories of things they do during the day to help people, because it's all over the place. I spoke to a group of superintendents from around the country a few years back. They're all complaining because, people don't understand them and everybody hates their schools and et cetera, et cetera. I said, listen, I guarantee you there's cool stuff going on in classrooms in every one of your districts in every part of the country. People need to hear those stories. Oh, that's great. And it's not inconsequential. We need to hear them over and over and over again in all corners of our lives.
Yeah. Can I just add something? A point I was going to, if we'd had more time, get to is that throughout Donald's book, he tells us about organizations and institutes that have really been working to promote this new agenda. So I totally agree with you, Archon. This is a war on many fronts, and there has been a real cultural assault. And just some of the organizations are ALEC, which, the Koch brothers, sort of American Legislative Exchange Council, the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, Manhattan Institute, Reason Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, Americans for Prosperity, Foundation for Government Accountability. I mean, the list goes on. So this is not just about, elections or, what the taxation is. So I do think that we have to, as we strategize to how we're going to combat it, we also have to think about, how to do that on a cultural front.
Yeah, great. And then I have a question that was asked earlier on our event page and comes up also from someone in Q&A, which pushes back a little bit, but I think in a constructive way. So the question is, which functions of government are actually better provided by business? So the questioner acknowledges that police, education, law, and order might be basic services that shouldn't be privatized, but outside of these, doesn't it promote better service, delivery, efficiency, entrepreneurship to the benefit of the consumer? So not the DMV problem. In the emerging economies, many public services are inefficient, and there's a call for privatization and competition to improve services. So what do you think? I mean, isn't there an efficiency gain there, at least for some of these things?
I get this question a lot, and it's sort of it's a question that requires its own hour, because it reduces too many things, right? So I mean, I'm not saying this in a negative to whoever asked the question. It's because, so first off, remember what I said: privatization is private control over public goods versus public control. There's public and private in everything. In the roads, in the schools that build the schools. So it's not a question of who, at the first level, it's not a question of who does. It's a question of, do we have standards? Are we in control? Do we have cops on the beat? Like the thing I said earlier. So that's the first thing I say. It's really, because, when you come up with a term like privatization, you think it's like a binary. It's not. It's a mishmash. It's a continuum and a mishmash of stuff. So that's the first point. The second point that I think is really, I mentioned earlier about efficiency. Right? Efficiency, you got to really be careful what you mean by efficiency, because if you're going to spend less money on something, it's very concrete what you're going to spend less money on, and that may not be in our interest. It is not in our interest to reduce wages and benefits for the several $1 trillion of procurement done in this country, because that has a material statistical impact on inequality, driving inequality in the country. It's for real. It's not a value question. So I think we need to really think, broadly about that. We need to really understand what efficiency really means. The other thing I'll finish by saying, again, I put our organizational email account in the chat, and I'll say it again at the end. I will be engaged with anybody on the call. I'll answer any of the questions later. Anybody who didn't get their question answered. I really, seriously, I'm home all week. I'll do it this week. Is that there's a difference between public and private, between private interests and public interests, and it's not a bad thing. They're just different things. So private, what do they want? They sell stuff. They want to sell as much as possible. They want to spend as little as possible providing it, and still provide it. They want a profit share. They want profits or returns to investors, and they want market share. That's what they want. They want to do a good job with whatever they're doing, but they measure those things, right? And that, again, that doesn't always work in our interest, because if they're cutting corners, if efficiency is cutting corners, no. If competition is excluding, which happens in charter schools, those that are costly to educate, no. So it really goes past everything is done publicly and privately that we care about, right? Yeah. And I would say, last thing I'll say in terms of contracting, anybody who's contracted to have their house painted knows that if you don't watch, bad things happen. So that's the point. That's the control part.
That's great. That's great. You have a couple, at least one, I think a couple of chapters in your book on water. And on this ideology point, I was thinking when I was reading those chapters, I went to Bolivia to visit very briefly a couple a long time ago now. And so I was trying to learn, I don't know anything about Bolivia. I was trying to learn about a little bit about the country. And one of the pivotal political moments was in the early 2000s. And there was a move to privatize some of the water supply. And all hell broke loose, right? I mean, people just really, really, really did not want that to happen. So it's just like interesting, a very different reaction to a privatization move there than in a bunch of the municipalities that you described, not really so much of a,
well,
of a big deal.
Our kind of say there have been a good number of remunicipalizations of water
Yeah.
systems in the US, some because they realized they could do it cheaper, and some because they realized they just wanted control of it. It's their water. They want the flexibility. They want they think they ought to have it. Yeah. I mean, let me say one other thing about competition real quick, because to move on, there's not really competition when you in contracting. It really is you compete to get the contract, and then you have a monopoly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, again, for the person who asked the question, that's for later interrogation.
Good.
But then also, I'd say you don't always compete to get the contract. Look at some of those Puerto Rican, the FEMA cases in Puerto Rico, where, friends of people in high places got the contract. So, if you're in your regulatory scheme that you think is going to improve this, there needs to be fair competition.
Yeah,
exactly. That's exactly right.
Good. In Liz's, when you were kind of going over some of the isms that are in the causal story, you mentioned racism, but you didn't have time to really delve into that very much. One of the questions in the Q&A is from Julia Johnson, who talks about Heather McGhee's wonderful, wonderful book, The Sum of Us, and talks about how racism has hurt all public services, in part because some white people, depending on those public goods, have invidious racial attitudes and want to deny those public goods to Black Americans. And for those of you who haven't read I was looking for, it's at home, I don't have it here, but the cover of the book is a white boy jumping into a pool and a Black girl climbing on the ladder out of the pool. I might have the races flipped. But anyway, the whole metaphor for the book is that all of these great public pools were built during and after the New Deal by WPA and other projects like Community Pride. And lots of people use these pools. And in the South, almost all of them were white because they were segregated. All these desegregation orders come down in the 50s and 60s. And many of these communities, instead of desegregating the pools, concrete them over, right? Can you imagine, right? I mean, and so that is like this, oh my God.
And set up private clubs.
Right.
Let's not forget, create private spaces.
Right, exactly, that are segregated. And so, the question is like, how do you think about the intersection of race and privatization in your story?
Well, to some extent to what you said. So, but I'll use the example of education, right? So, the privatization of public education at its root, say in the 50s, when it really, at its inception, was a segregationist response to Brown versus Board of Education, period, right? Black families didn't want their kids in schools. I mean, white families didn't want their kids in school with Black kids. So states then created voucher policies.
Uh-oh, we lost your...
You lost your sound again. Uh-oh. We've lost your sound. Is he coming?
Oh, no, he's not even hearing us.
I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. Yeah, you're back now.
Yeah, no, when you can't hear me, I can't hear you either.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, you're back now.
So racism in public education started with the school choice movement, which was a segregationist response to Brown versus Board of Education. You hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, because you freeze. We definitely need all fiber optics to every home in America paid for by the federal government. Let's just be very clear at this point. So what happened is you put public education into the market where parents could choose to put their kids in a school with other white kids. And so created white flight academies and segregation academies. I'm really hoping you can hear me because you're both frozen. And you can't, but now you can.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so it's enormously impactful, right? And you see that white the school choice movement today, which is about school, increasing number of charter schools and increasing number of vouchers, it's not quite as explicitly racist, but its impacts are the same. We're seeing increasing segregation because we're putting things in the market. Markets exclude, choice excludes. I mean, there's nothing wrong with choice, but choice is exclusionary. And so what you're seeing is with the growth of charters and vouchers, you're seeing increasing segregation again. I want to tie that back together with Heather's work in the swimming pools. These are the places, schools, parks, libraries are the places we actually do come together, right? And create community of people of different background, of different ideologies, of religions, of class, of race, of ethnicity, which I believe is one of the worst impacts of privatization is a divided America. Privatized America, I believe, is a divided America because we really are just consumers wanting to meet our own individual needs. And those are when you put everything in the market, when you turn things into a commodity, we are just consumers.
So there's a number of pretty remarkable people putting stuff in the chat. One of whom is Heather Booth, and I think it's probably the Heather Booth. If you don't know who she is, type her name into Google right now. But Heather says, thank you, Donald, for this terrific overview. What are the highest priority things that you think we need to do to address this privatization? It feels so all around us. It seems hard to know what the first even one or two steps out of it are. So what are the priorities?
Okay, so Heather's a dear friend. This is a very Heather question. Please Google her. She is a force of nature and historically significant person in American life. So I think on the short term, we can do that at the local level. You can do that at the state level. You can do it at the federal level. And I don't think there's just one bill here because we're talking about lots of different services implemented at different levels of governance. We need to pass laws that increase those standards and make sure that they are, that we have the resources to make sure they happen, right? Because often when something gets contracted out, this is the downside is, what you really need to do if you contract something out is you need to increase the staff of people who are monitoring and paying attention. That doesn't happen, right? Too often. So that's the first thing. And for people who want to prevent privatization from happening, the most important thing we say is pay attention. Pay attention, and this is maybe more at the state and local level. When you hear a rumor that something might get outsourced, or there's infrastructure money going to be coming down the pike from the federal bill that passed, you should be paying attention to the priorities in your community and making sure that you start asking the hard questions about those things before it's too late. Who's going to provide those things? Infrastructure, what are the priority projects? Are they the ones that can make money for the private sector, or are they ones that the community needs? So there's this, ability to ask the questions about the public goods and things around us is not inconsequential at all. It's central to what we teach people to do.
So Donald, did you look, I'm just curious because we don't see a lot of discussion about the infrastructure bill that passed. Was there a serious interrogation of, who benefits from this?
Well, we didn't work in Washington. We work with allies who do. So we know, yes, there was a fight over it. In water, I think our side won. You can't, we stopped, a real push towards water privatization within the WIFI, I think it was called. There are two pieces of the infrastructure bill that allow privatization. One is called asset recycling, taking a current asset and being able to sell it off, like they did with Chicago parking meters. So we're worried about that. And then there's also incentives, and I can't remember the specific details of the incentives, to consider public-private partnerships, for the states and localities that are going to, apply for the money. And what that means is they're going to see if they could mix public money with private investor capital. And when you would bring in private investor capital, that is often in exchange for control of the asset for many years. Mm-hmm. So we are, again, organizationally, we're starting to train people around the country just to pay attention and to ask the hard questions. Because when you do ask the hard questions, people realize that, it's not actually that good a deal. We've actually helped organizations and mayors and other people interrogate privatization proposals of infrastructure, and after asking these, like a little bit in the weeds questions, they make a decision. No, it'd be better to keep it public.
So this is a little bit of a follow-up to that from Barbara Thornton in the Q&A. This is probably last question or second to last question. She says, I'm particularly interested in privatization or public-private partnerships, which you write a lot about, involving municipal and county governments. So she says, local government is totally outgunned by contracting experts on the private side. She says, very personally, I see this in post-war Orange County, California. So her question is, where and how did this start vis-a-vis local government? And my question following up is, what do you do about it? If, awareness is one thing, but if you're outgunned, you're outgunned. So, yikes.
Well, yeah, well, it's a huge problem, is the capacity gap, huge problem. So you have to, that's why my work is to help build that, governments and others and advocates help build that capacity. So where it started is, reduced revenues, devolution, increased responsibility, reduced revenues, private sector, we're in a massive sales job. We can solve your problems, right? In that sea. When your faces look different, I think you can't hear me.
No, you're okay.
Okay, good. Okay, I really get it. So that's really is, and so what they come in, what the promoters of privatization say is, we'll solve your problem. It's cheaper, better, faster, no new taxes. All of you can kind of knock down one by one because, maybe no new taxes, but higher fees. So, you can kind of go down the list. So it started throughout this whole period of time: austerity, sales, ideological promotion, and then, taking over, conservative places taking over, government agencies. I do think, though, I will go back to what I was just saying about the interrogation. You can, if you can get a policymaker or a community asking the hard questions about these deals. I didn't talk about the Chicago parking meters. We don't have much time, but they sold their parking meters for 75 years. Now, and they did the deal too quick. Horrible things happened. The city has now lost the ability to create bus lanes to a great extent, dedicated bus lanes, because they have to keep the contractor whole. Had the question been asked in advance, it was done in the heat of the recession, will there be limits on our ability to expand mass transit? Yes or no? What will happen to the parking meter rates? You can project forward. This is what I said last week in a meeting with the mayor of Miami when I was there. You have to get people to project forward. What are the cost implications, the service implications, the externality implications? Then you have to get them to think laterally, right? What are the impact on the jobs? What's the impact on the community? So we have great success when we can do that. I live in LA, the person lives in Orange County, give me a call. I'll tell you how to do it.
That's great. You should advocate for privatization impact statements to really flesh it out, right?
And we do. I mean, we fundamentally do in lots of sectors. We have lots of documents that go through these questions, and you can do it right.
Yeah.
You can do it right. You just raise the standards and you make it happen. It just turns out that it's expensive.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There are literally dozens of fantastic questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and I apologize for not being able to get to those. We'll definitely save them, and then maybe Donald, can't answer personally, but maybe it'll be of some use in subsequent things that you do. But just right now, I just want to close out by thanking Liz Cohen and Donald Cohen, no relationship, for just a fantastic, illuminating, very inspiring conversation. So thank you very, very much for taking this hour, and everybody in the audience, and have a great evening if you're on the East Coast.
Thank you.
And feel free. Look, I'm easy to find on the internet. Get in the public interest. Don't hesitate. Reach out. We'll get we'll answer your questions.
Great. Thank you very much.